In part one of this lesson, we talked about panoptic control. Panoptic control is when we use surveillance or even the idea of surveillance to make people believe that they're constantly being watched so that their behavior is always what we would deem appropriate. So we talked about some examples of that being Santa or the elf on the shelf or cameras in schools being in the hallways or some other good examples are when you're driving down the road and you see a police car on the side of the road and you can't even tell if there's a cop in the car. Sometimes you pass by this spot every day and the cop car is always there and you can never really tell if somebody's in there, but just in case you slow down, you make sure you're going the speed limit. That's a form of panoptic control. So I want to talk about how panoptic control is applied to women in the 19th century. So during the 19th century, they had this sort of idea called the cult of domesticity or the cult of true womanhood. Both are correct ideas. And basically, this idea was that women and men should live in separate spheres. Men should go to work and be involved in politics, and women should not. They should stay home. The idea was that politics and business, all of these things were corrupting. And what women were supposed to do is they were supposed to create this environment of peace and tranquility for men to come home to. That was their job. Women were not supposed to have careers, especially middle class women were not supposed to have careers. They were not supposed to read too much. They were certainly not supposed to be writers or professionals in any form. And there was this general belief that women who were depressed, women who suffered from any form of mental illness were suffering from what we call hysteria. And it was this basic idea that women were delicate flowers, and if they thought too much, their mind would break, and the only way to cure them was the rest cure. So the rest cure, as I already said, is this idea that you should never take up a pen or a pencil or read books if you're a woman, because if you do, it will drive you crazy. So in Why I Wrote the Yellow Wallpaper, Charlotte Perkins Gilman describes her own experience with the rest cure. So here I am in the fourth paragraph of Why I Wrote the Yellow Wallpaper. And she talks about having this sort of nervous condition, this melancholia, this depression. And she says, "This wise man put me to bed and applied the rest cure, to which a still good physique responded so promptly that he concluded that there was nothing much the matter with me, and sent me home with solemn advice to live as domestic a life as possible, so cook, clean, take care of babies, and to have but 2 hours of intellectual life a day, and to never touch a pen, a brush, or a pencil again so long as I lived." And this was in 1887. So he tells her she's been sort of broken by her intellectual activity and that she needs to act more like a lady, go home, cook and clean, and take care of some babies. I went home, and this is in the next paragraph. I went home and obeyed those directions for some 3 months and came so near the borderline of utter mental ruin that I could see over. Then, using remnants of intelligence that remained and helped by a wise friend, I cast the noted specialist's advice to the winds and went to work again. So she decides to ignore his advice and goes back to work, goes back to writing, goes back to reading. And it is this that she feels helps her escape from her depression. And then about 3 paragraphs up from the end of the text, she says, "The little book, this short story, is valued by alienists." An alienist is an early form of a psychologist or therapist, people who are interested in the way in which the mind works. And so she's saying that doctors and early psychologists were interested in her text. And she said, "It has, to my knowledge, saved one woman from a similar fate, so terrifying her family that they let her out into normal activity and she recovered." So one of the reasons that she writes the Yellow Wallpaper is in response to the way 19th century society is treating women, this cult of domesticity, and this constant surveillance placed on women specifically, constantly being watched, telling them how they should act, telling them what they should think, telling them what they should wear, telling them what they should do. And she is arguing that this treatment of women is dangerous, that it could even cause mental problems for women, specifically depression and some of the other problems that she suffered. So let's look at how the text reflects her call to write. We talked about call to write when we read The Cask of Amontillado. And the call to write is the influence on the author, what's going on in and around the author that makes them want to write this text. Remember that call to write can be personal, as it was for Poe, and it can also be social or cultural, as it is here for Charlotte Perkins Gilman. It is both personal and it's also cultural and social. It can be political and it can be historical, and we're going to look at examples of that later. So let's look and see how the text then reflects the author's call to write. One of the things that we see is the way in which the narrator is infantilized or treated like a child. The author argues that this cult of domesticity and the constant surveillance of women is basically, in effect, making them perpetual children. Remember, this is a similar argument to what Heinrich Ibsen made himself. He was the author of A Dollhouse. So here we see examples of that in the text through the characterization of John. Dear John, he gathered me up in his arms and just carried me upstairs to the nursery and laid me on the bed and sat by me and read to me until it tired my head. Later on, he will call her a little girl. What is it, little girl? He said, don't go walking about like that. You'll get cold. So this sort of infantilization of the woman through John, who is not just her husband, but also a doctor and a representative of the medical community. We see the infantilization of women through the setting of the nursery. The nursery has bars on the windows and a bed that's nailed down, and all of these things make the author feel imprisoned. And we see that imprisonment symbolized in the yellow wallpaper itself. At night, in any kind of light, in twilight, candlelight, lamplight, and worst of all, by moonlight, it becomes bars. The outside pattern, I mean, and the woman behind it is as plain as can be. Sometimes I think there are a great many women behind. And it's this line here that tells us that she's not just writing about her own personal experience, but about the experience of all women in the 19th century. And then later on, she's talking about that woman behind the wallpaper who's really herself. And she is all the time trying to climb through, but nobody could climb through that pattern. It so strangles. And I think that is why it has so many heads. So it's talking about, again, how destructive this constant control and constant surveillance is for women. And we see then also elements of this attempt through the author and the narrator to liberate these women. As soon as it was moonlight and that poor thing began to crawl and shake the pattern, I got up and ran to help her. She then starts to rip off all the wallpaper, and she says, I wonder if they all came out of that paper as I did. So in writing this story, she is actually sort of ripping off that wallpaper. It's kind of interesting here at the end, see the last bullet point, how does paper both imprison and liberate the narrator? Writing makes her feel better. And for the author, writing the story made her feel better. And in a sense, it allowed her to liberate other women. In Why I Wrote the Yellow Wallpaper, the author talks about how another family had read her short story and was so terrified by that story that they no longer forced their daughter, wife, female relative to endure the rescuer. So this concept of the paper being this way that we can liberate women is sort of interestingly symbolic in the text. So let's say that I wanted to write about this in my research paper, and in my analysis paragraph, I wanted to talk about how the text reflects the author's call to write. One of the ways that the text reflects the author's call to write is through the character of John. So I might explore the character of John using text paragraph organization. Here is a slide that sort of reminds you how of that concept, text paragraph organization, which you should be more than familiar with. But if you want to take a second to pause to refresh your memory, you might want to do that. So let's say I was going to create a topic sentence in which I stated opinion about the importance of the character John, the husband, in the yellow wallpaper. I might write, through the description of the narrator's husband, Gilman seems to be implying that men in general, and doctors in particular, are to blame for the mental and physical deterioration of women in the 19th century. So John becomes this representative of men, specifically medical professionals in the 19th century. Right? And so now that I have a topic sentence, I need evidence. So I'm going to quote or paraphrase or summarize from the text. As the narrator explains, quote, John is a physician, and perhaps this is one reason I do not get well faster. He hardly lets me stir without special direction. I have a scheduled prescription for each hour in the day, and he takes all care for me. One of the things that I want you to note here is my use of parenthetical citation. So there I have the author's name does not appear in the introduction to the quote. So the author's name must appear in the parenthetical citation. Then I have this quote, and part of the quote appears on page 31 of my copy of the text, and part of it appears on page 33. And I have put these little ellipses in to show you where I've cut elements that I don't need. So then I have Gilman 31 through 33, and because I don't have lines or para or anything else, this tells you that I'm talking about page numbers. Then I have a period after my parenthetical citation. So once I have evidence, I have to explain the importance of that evidence. So here's this quote that the author provides. What does this mean? What are we meant to learn from this? John tells his wife what to do, where to sleep, and how to think. According to the narrator, John has taken away everything she cares about, her work, her friends, even her thoughts. Now that I have explained the evidence itself, what we're supposed to learn from this, I have to explain how it supports the argument I made in my topic sentence, how John is a representative of 19th century men, specifically 19th century physicians. John's position as husband and physician gives him power over his wife, and he uses his power to control her. It is this control that eventually breaks her, supporting Gilman's argument that men's dominance in the public sphere and in the home is dangerous to 19th century women. So now I have all four elements and I can put it together into one paragraph. And here is that paragraph. You might even want to pause it for a second, but I'll read it for you. Through the description of the narrator's husband, Gilman seems to be implying that men in general and doctors in particular are to blame for the mental and physical deterioration of women in the 19th century. As the narrator explains, quote, John is a physician, and perhaps this is one of the reasons I do not get well faster. He hardly lets me stir without special direction. I have a special prescription for each hour in the day. He takes all care for me. John tells his wife what to do, where to sleep, and how to think. According to the narrator, John has taken away everything she cares about, her work, her friends, even her thoughts. John's position as husband and physician gives him power over his wife, and he uses his power to control her, to infantilize her. It is this control that eventually breaks her, supporting Gilman's argument that men's dominance in the public sphere and in the home is dangerous to 19th century women. So hopefully this example will give you an idea of what you're going to be doing in your research paper, which we won't really start talking about in depth until next week, but this is a start.